For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. How do you do that? How do you continue to do good when it's criticized and challenged and people speak falsely and accusatory? And how is it that when God is challenging us to behave right and to do right and to live right, and yet we have detractors and maybe those who are very even close to us and personal to us, and they seemingly do all things that they can to harm and create difficulties for us when we're simply trying to do what God has said is good? We're simply trying to behave and make choices and decisions in our life that God has qualified as behaviors that He would desire from us, and we can't seem to get any support in that. We can't seem to find the encouragement at times that we're looking for when all we're trying to do is the good that God has challenged us to do. And sometimes it's hard for us to find that help and that aid. Sometimes it's hard for us to find the source that we're looking for to bring the encouragement. And it's interesting, though, if you back up just a little further in that narrative that Larry just read for us, notice in verse 13, he said, "Who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good?" Ultimately, no one can do anything to us when we're doing that which is good. No permanent damage, if you will, no eternal damage, really is probably what he's driving at here. There's no eternal harm by those who are detractors of that which is good, but there is eternal harm if I abandon that which is good because of the detractors. Even if we must suffer for doing what is right, then he says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you're blessed. Do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled, he says. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, in verse 15, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. That's a text, by the way, that I think sometimes we take out of the context in which it's said and maybe don't fully understand what it is God's driving at there through the Apostle Peter. Because when he says there, be ready to give an answer or a defense for every man who asks of the reason of hope that is within us, he says that in the context of those who are challenging us for believing those things. He says that amidst the context of those who might be questioning us for the good that we're striving to do in the cause of Christ and for the purposes of eternal benefit, and we're suffering because of it. Be ready to give an answer as to why it is I have this hope, why it is that I've dedicated myself to the good that is described by the Creator, why it is that I've chosen this life and this path and these decisions that I've made. How do I handle the critics and detractors in life? How do I handle those who tend to point the finger every time I'm just striving to do what God has said is good and right? How do I handle the critics of good? And so I want to do that with you, actually, and I hope, I know that I could probably get away with about 6 months worth of sermons. I think I could do that, because I think by month 7, you'd probably forget what I preached on month 1, and I could do it again. But here's my point. We were just not that long ago, hopefully you remember, we went into the book of Nehemiah, and we talked about the hand of God, if you remember that lesson. We talked about how Nehemiah was able to accomplish and fulfill the purposes of God, because throughout the narrative you watch, and every time that there's something that needs to be resolved, the text will say, and the hand of God was upon him, or the hand of the Lord was with him, or some phrase like that. And we talked about how empowering that must have been for Nehemiah and those that were his followers, how empowering it is for us to know that when we are challenged, the hand of God is with us. But I want to go back to that text with you for a little while this morning and talk about the fact that even though the hand of God was with Nehemiah, and though the Lord was with him every step of the way in the choices and decisions that were laid before him, it didn't mean he didn't have detractors and critics along that path. If you recall that history very briefly with me for a moment, Artaxerxes, if you remember now, is taken over there in Babylon and sends Ezra the priest to care for the righteous needs of the people. Ezra takes that part of that first wave, if you will, of folks who go back into Jerusalem, and he's been given this liberty to do that, and he has gone back and he begins to build the religious fabric of the people in that land again. And there's lots of history that unfolds in relationship to that. Nehemiah becomes the cupbearer to the king. Now, you've heard us talk about before that when you're the cupbearer to the king, that's a serious job. Because the king undoubtedly has all kinds of enemies, and if you're about to serve him something to drink, he wants to make sure that there's only that which will be beneficial to him in that cup. The cupbearer's job wasn't just to bring the cup to the king. The cupbearer's job was to secure the king, that no one was trying to poison him, harm him, bring challenge to him. Verse 3 of Nehemiah chapter 1, if you're with me there. Nehemiah chapter 1 and in verse 3. Nehemiah has entered as he's had this responsibility before the king. And they said to me, verse 3, as they brought back word, some of the captives bringing back word about things concerning Jerusalem, they said to Nehemiah, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Now you can imagine how disheartening, just pause and put your history mind on for a moment. You can only imagine how disheartening that must have been, because these folks finally get a chance to go home, right? They've been in captivity for 70 years. Ezra begins to lead this first wave of folks back into Jerusalem, and you arrive on the scene, and it is just ruins everywhere you look. It had been laid waste and desolate, and how disheartening it must have been. And now word is coming back to men like Nehemiah about what condition they found when they arrived there in Jerusalem and the things that they saw. So it was, verse 4, when I heard these words, speaking again Nehemiah, that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days, was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. The mere thought of his great homeland, his wonderful Jerusalem, his place that meant so much to him and his people, when they find it just in disarray when they arrive there, and it continues to be such in many ways, and some things still have yet to be accomplished in restoring the people, as he hears about the condition of Jerusalem. And so he decides in chapter 2, and there's lots of extra history there, but we'll fast forward for a moment. He decides that he's going to have a conversation with the king about this. In chapter 2, beginning at verse 1, it come to pass in the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Now again, remember what I just told you about the responsibility of the cupbearer. And for the first time in all the times as he's had this job, he walks into the king and his countenance looks completely different. And I don't know about you, but if I'm the king and my cupbearer walks in and he looks different for the first time ever, he's got a problem. It reminds me of a time Bob visiting with his son. I won't name him again, cameras. But anyway, we were playing a game at our house, had a lot of the teenagers over, and we'd been playing this game, and he was always disappointed because he didn't get to be the one specific person in the game. And didn't get to be the person, complained all night. Finally, his moment to be the person, and his countenance changed. And everybody went, it's him, right? His countenance changed. And immediately it brought your suspect, right? Immediately. Well, cupbearer Nehemiah walks in. The king notices his countenance is much different than he'd ever been before. King's concerned about that. Therefore the king said to me in verse 2, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart, so I became dreadfully afraid. He's scared. How's the king going to react to this? What's going on? He said to the king, may the king live forever. I'm not here to hurt you. You're not here to be harmed. Nothing's happened. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire? And then the king said to me, what do you request? Powerful, right? What do you request? And we talked about a few weeks ago about how the hand of the Lord was with Nehemiah. The king just said, what do you want? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Great side point, by the way. Before you're asking the king for something big, you might want to ask the ultimate king of all things for some aid and help in that moment. So he prays before the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. And furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple of the city, and for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And that was the study that we had a few weeks ago. My point is simply to remind you of this history that's happening here. He goes and he speaks to the king. This king says, okay, not only will I send you, but we read further, he ultimately gives him more and more and more to make this possible. Everything good that needs to happen seems to have happened. The hand of the Lord has been with Nehemiah. The king's agreeing to all this, and even more so. He's given him money that he needs to go. He's given him tax exemptions we studied a few weeks ago. He's given everything necessary to begin the process of doing that which is good. And you might think that while all of this is going in Nehemiah's favor, that everyone would just join in with him and recognize the favor of God that was happening. But it doesn't take long for Nehemiah to begin to arrive there, and the critics show up. And those are the ones that often create the challenges. Notice verse 10 of the same chapter we were just in. All of that sounded great through verse 8, didn't it? Everything seems to be going just exactly as it should. Good things are going to happen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. When they hear that there's a guy coming and his interest is in rebuilding these people and allowing them to reestablish themselves as a people there in Jerusalem, Sanballat begins to determine it from the very earliest of stages to become a thorn in the side of Nehemiah and to create trouble. Friends, just mark it down. Anytime you and I strive to do that which is good and right in the eyes of God, inevitably a Sanballat will show up. And he will want nothing more than to cause you and I trouble and hardship in the process of doing what God has challenged us to do. We cannot allow men like him to become the detractors of that which is good. We cannot let the Sanballats of the world push me away from the purposes that God has outlined for me. There will always be troublemakers that go into the face of the cause of Christ. We must persevere through that. Jump to chapter 4, verse 3. There's a man by the name of Tobiah. In chapter 4 and in verse 3 it is said of him, now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build. Deeply disturbed, right? Chapter 2, verse 10. Folks, deeply disturbed by the fact that these folks are going to reestablish themselves in Jerusalem. Now you've got Tobiah saying, the Ammonite who was standing there said, whatever they build, if a fox goes up on it, he'll break it down. Their stone wall. Okay, even if they're able to build a few things, they'll never be able to build anything of quality. That wall will be so thin and so desperate in need of any kind of strengthening that even if a fox decides to crawl up on that wall, it'll just knock it over. And sometimes in life we run into those folks like that. You claim you're serving your God. You claim you're striving to go to heaven. You claim you're seeking the salvation that God desires for you. And you're claiming to be all that. You'll never have any success at that. You'll never complete that. You'll never finish that course. You'll never be any good at following God. You'll never be the kind of Christian that you desire to be. The sarcastic critics will show up. And they'll strive to get you and I to be convinced that we could never amount to any good in this life. Nothing I could do will ever equate to anything good. Why even bother trying? A fox could knock over your faith with just a simple walking across it. Then you've got men like Geshem. Go back, there's a couple of moments you see him. Chapter 2, verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us. And to begin to say, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? They had no intentions of rebelling against the king, by the way, did they? And no intentions of rebelling against anyone. In fact, they're there fulfilling what the king permitted them to be doing. But now all of a sudden what they're actually doing is being distorted by men like Geshem. And they're saying, well, you're actually here setting up for a rebellion against the king. Jump to chapter 6 and in verse 6. And it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. You hint at the rumor in chapter 2, then you just kind of begin to formalize it in chapter 6, and you begin to get people to think that there's some ulterior going on here, and this gossip begins to be spread, and it detracts from the good that's trying to be accomplished. You've got men like Noadiah. I promise I'll slow down in a second. Verse 14, chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 14. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. Why I mention Noadiah is it appears that that prophetess should actually be on Nehemiah's side. Sometimes when you're trying to do that which is good, and all of a sudden you become blindsided by somebody who you thought should have been standing right there with you, and they're joining in the fray of creating challenges for you. Sometimes when you're trying to do what is right and good in the eyes of God, sometimes the most hard things to overcome are the attacks and challenges that come from those who should be helping you. My dad always used to say that the greatest challenges to faith don't come from the world, they come from the guy down the pew. That's heavy, but sometimes there's some truth to it. Right? I expect the world to detract. I expect the world to criticize. I expect the world to not understand my faith. I expect it in some ways why the world doesn't want to join hands with me. I get that. I can at least understand that somebody choosing to want to live worldly would not want anything that would have to do with that which is good and right in the eyes of God. But what about the prophetess Noadiah, who I was kind of counting on to lend their voice with what we're trying to do here for the cause of God? And the next thing I know, I'm dealing with more frustration and more fears and more angst and anxiety because of those who should have been standing with me. There's guys like Shemaiah. Stay there in chapter 6, verse 10. Afterward, I came in the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delilah, the son of Mahabal, who was a secret informer. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. And I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. And so now I've got guys who, again, are supposed to be helping me, but they're willing to take bribes in order to trap me in some circumstance while I'm still trying to do the good of God. What's the point, Brian? The point is simply this, that when you strive to do good, people are going to show up and criticize that. When you strive to honor God, there will always be those, even though the hand of the Lord is with you. Even though the Lord has given His blessing to what you're accomplishing and doing, even though there is great help along the way, there will be those who show up with nothing but trouble in their hearts. There will be those who arrive with nothing but malintent in their minds and hearts. I've got to be ready to overcome that. I have to be ready to overcome their tactics and the ways in which they strive to create these problems. Yes, they're going to ridicule. Good has always been ridiculed. Righteousness has always been scoffed at and laughed at and made fun of. Do good anyway. Honor the righteousness of God anyway. It will not be anything new for the good that God challenges us to live and be, to be ridiculed by the detractors. It won't be anything new. They were doing it in the days of Nehemiah. You can't build anything that has any strength. You can't accomplish anything that will amount to anything. All the distractions and all the detractors come along, and they bring with them the ridicule and mockery. Do good anyway. Some of them may even be motivated by their anger towards you. The audacity to live righteous before God, right? You ever felt that way? It's like, how dare you try to honor God? How dare you try to live righteous and faithful? And the tactics that they'll use, and they get angry with us. Get upset as if we had caused some calamity for them because we're striving to do what is right. It so happened, verse 1 of Nehemiah chapter 4, it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall that he was furious. Why? He's furious, he's indignant, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" You don't have to raise your hand. I'll raise my hand on behalf of all of us. Have you ever failed? Right? Have you ever tried to correct a mistake and the detractor showed up? You ever tried to seek repentance and forgiveness and change in your life and the detractors showed up? That's kind of what's happening here, by the way. Nehemiah has brought back people to do what? To ask God's forgiveness. We need to rebuild the nation. We've got to be the people of God again. He punished us and brought us into captivity and condemnation because of our former behaviors, and they are striving to the best of their ability to get back into the right path that God had challenged them to be, and the detractors show up. It happens. When you and I are striving to do what is right and change things in our lives and to improve things in our lives, the critics show up. You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be what you think you'll be, and all the things that they throw at us. Why bother? Don't let Satan win. There'll be folks who become indignant towards us and angry about us and say all manner of evil against us, all because we're just trying to change our lives. We're just trying to be better. And they're motivated by anger at that for some reason or another. Even when the hand of the Lord is with us, the detractors still show up. Verse 8, chapter 4. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. You know, it's one thing, I got to deal with somebody who's criticizing my effort to do what's right and good in the eyes of God, but it's even a more frustrating moment when now all of a sudden they're trying to get other people involved in it. They're trying to pull other people into their way of thinking, and they begin to combine their efforts to create challenges and conspiracies and thoughts and difficulties towards me. Trying to get folks, maybe if in my own family, maybe if in my own circle of friends, maybe folks that I had loved and trusted, and all of a sudden now people are trying to get them to conspire against the good that I'm trying to do, that God has challenged me in. It's sad. discouraging, and hurtful. But unfortunately, when you and I strive to do that which is good and right in the eyes of God, here it comes. And there will be all kinds of tactics and measures and things that they will use to try to create these problems. And they'll do everything they can to distract us from doing that which is good. Verse 1, chapter 6. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors and the gates. So the wall's done. The gates aren't quite finished. That's the point he makes. Then Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I'm doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. Brother and friend, can I encourage you, when you are pursuing that which is good and right, don't let anybody distract you from that. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, follow the path of God's righteousness always. Always. And don't let the detractor come along and tell us that the choices of good that God has led us to, that we should be spending our time and energy somewhere else. They've reached a point now that completion's almost finished. All we got to do is hang the gates, and we've completed the wall. And now the detractors see the accomplished work, and they begin to think, well, the only thing left we can do is maybe get Nehemiah distracted long enough that they won't finish. Don't let the detractors pull you away from the good you're striving to do in the cause of God and Christ. Don't let them begin to persuade you that your time and energies need to be spent elsewhere when I'm striving to focus upon that which is good. Keep reading just a few more verses and I'll rest our thoughts this morning. Then Sanballat, verse 5, chapter 6. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time. 4 times, Nehemiah says the same answer each time. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, that you and the Jews plan, this is that text we read earlier, that the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, There is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so come therefore, and let us consult together. We've heard from the rumors of Geshem, remember him earlier, that you all are doing all this work because you plan to rebel and cause problems for the king, and if you don't come talk to us, we're going to tell the king on you. Interesting, isn't it? We're gonna tattle, and I guess it's childish, isn't it, really? We're going to tell the king what you're really up to down here. But here's the response, verse 8. Then I sent to him, saying, No such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. What I love about Nehemiah's response is it's simple to the point. He doesn't play their game. He doesn't give them a 55 million word dissertation as to what they're actually doing. When the false accusers arrive and they accuse him of the rumors that Geshem had spread, and they claim that he's creating problems for the king, and he says that he's nation building in order to rebel, all the good that he was trying to actually do and all the challenges he presents before Nehemiah concerning those things, Nehemiah's simple response is this: not true. I'm not doing any of that. And sometimes, folks, when you're striving to do that which is good and the detractors just won't stop, and we've worked and worked and worked, we feel like all we'd get done is appeasing the detractors. We feel like all we ever get done is answering the critics. and responding to those who are challenging our faith and our conscious effort to honor God, may I simply suggest to all of us this morning that sometimes when we begin to witness the tactics of those who are criticizing, they're not legitimately asking us about their faith. They're not legitimately asking us to give an answer of the hope that is within us. They're not legitimately seeking some kind of response. They're simply causing trouble for me and my walk with God. When you and I recognize that, sometimes the answer is simple. If they're lying, if there's fault, not true. And get back to work with God. Sometimes we spend a whole lot of time trying to respond to and answer the critics and the detractors and those who cause difficulty and harm to all that is good and right. And it's exhausting. And I never spend any time building my faith because I'm all the time just dealing with those who want to try to get me to make shipwreck of it. And they weary me. Maybe those are moments where rather than just letting them continue to exhaust us, we say, enough. I'm going to serve the Lord. Enough. I'm going to do the good that God has called me to do and be. That's what I'm going to do. And maybe not spend countless moments in our lives striving to appease those who will never be appeased, who will never like any answer or response that you provide. There was no honesty in Sanballat or Tobiah or Geshem or Noadiah. There was no honesty in these individuals. They were simply causing trouble. Don't let those who are simply causing trouble in your life keep you from your faith, from your convictions, from your service, from your eternal home. Don't let Satan win twice by keeping your mind occupied in this life and distracting you enough that we lose out on the eternal side as well. How can we help you today? How can we help you step into the promises of God this morning? How can we help you know the beauty of remission of sins and the cleansing of those sins? How can we encourage you to step back into your faith if you've walked away? What can we pray for you about this morning? And if there's something that we could help you in to just simply do what is good in the eyes of God, and we can encourage you in that way this morning, we'd invite you to come as we stand and as